Georgia. We thank you that you have blessed us with the opportunity to gather here today, and we ask that you would be a part of this, that you give us wisdom that we need to do the right thing, because we ask these things in your name. Amen.
We're going to start with House Bill 877, and Chairman Roberts, I think you're the author of the bill, so let's go ahead. Everybody here out there? You all here? Okay. All right. You have somebody going to come up with you, or are you going to be?
No, I'll try to, Mr. Chairman, I'll try to do this one on my own to start off with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no ladies. Gentlemen of the committee, this is my first time before Motor Vehicles Committee, and I am happy to be here with you today to bring before you House Bill 877. It is a long bill, but in all actuality, it is not a bill that is really that complicated. To kind of give you an update, and you should have these same talking points inside your folder as well. But there has been a task force that's been working for a long time now, trying to help to make sure that our cities and all across the state and all have the same kind of laws, that we can kind of be uniform when it comes to, as we're now putting into code, PTVs. You know, for years we had golf carts, and we just played golf off of them. But then over the years, they have really expanded past that point. And now in a lot of our cities and all, people use them to get around, especially when gas prices went up. There was a lot of city ordinances that was passed. I know in the small town that I live in, or that I live outside of, but right where I'm at, they passed the city ordinance as well, that you could go in and you could use golf carts to be able to maneuver around the city streets or whatever, to be able to help individuals to get around at a cheaper price and to save gas. And it's worked out well, but over the, I guess, several years, you've had different cities and all adopting different policies. So what we tried to do was, the task force was put together to try to get some consensus across the state. The one thing that you can see is it basically updates and modernizes the Georgia Motor Vehicle Code as it relates to motorized carts and personal transportation vehicles, and establishing Georgia as the model for other states to use these vehicles in public ways. I probably don't have to tell most of you, but if you don't know, we have 3 major golf cart manufacturers in this state: Easy Go, Club Cart, and Yamaha. In fact, 90% of those vehicles are right here in North America, and 80% of the world are built right here in this great state. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, that's something to be said, that we have that. There's over 4,000 jobs that are created from this market, plus not to mention all the other little mom and pop stores that, so to speak, have went up, that go in and retrofit these golf carts around. I mean, I use them for hunting, but a lot of people use them to get around in other areas, and you've probably seen them there locally. We're trying to eliminate the confusion here that for current laws governing local bodies. You know, most of you may remember last year I had a piece of legislation that basically come in, and we put signs up, and when you're coming in to the communities, to let people know that these are golf cart communities, so that you wouldn't have to go in and label each and every street where there was a crossing, which was current law if you read it correctly. So we tried to go back in and streamline. This bill just tries to streamline it across the state. We consolidate the definition of personal transportation vehicle, and it creates a framework by which local governments can create a transportation plan. And the general design of the criteria for the PTV lanes, uniform traffic markers and signage, permitting process for the PTVs, minimum safety criteria for the operators, transportation interference with other modes of transit and community involvement. It does grandfather in places like Peachtree City. I know every time we start talking about golf carts, or now as we're going to call them PTVs, then, you know, Peachtree City is a model that we've all looked to. They were proactive and thought outside the box very wisely many years ago and developed that community around that. And so every time we start dealing with this subject matter, we have to make sure that we don't go in and we don't affect what they already have in place. This bill does not. And it basically, it maintains local autonomy in determining the requirements, registration, and insurance, etc. there, and standardizes the crossing of the major thoroughfares. You know, I'll give you an example in Osceola, which is a very small town. We have 2 red lights, so I mean, we're not talking about a huge place. But you go up and you get a tag. That tag is $15, and you buy it, and it's good for basically for life. But it does put a tag on the back, and it just simply says Osceola. It has a little sticker down at the bottom. But that lets the law enforcement know that you've went up there, you've told them what kind of vehicle that you have, and you've given who owns the vehicle, and you have to make sure that the individual is of age to be able to operate that vehicle. Mr. Chairman and members, that's what this bill does, and it gives some clarity, and it's been a lot of work and an effort just went into creating this by a lot of different individuals throughout the state. And I'll be glad to try to answer any questions. I see Chairman Powell smiling over there. What you got?
Well, I'm going to recognize Chairman Battles here first. Any question?
Well, I just have a question. You touched on insurance liability. Can you talk about that just a little bit? Operating those, who's covers that in case you were to hit another vehicle or do property damage?
It actually, it basically what it says in here is that local governments are not responsible for it. In other words, you can't hold the local government responsible for if there's an accident. In other words, if Osceola issues me that permit, that tag or whatever, and I have a wreck, then at that point they can't be held responsible. I would be responsible for it, so you couldn't go back on the local government.
Okay. Well, going back to that again, would that be covered under homeowners, or that just, you know, what is it covered under?
Mine personally is. I don't know each and every person how theirs would be, but the one that I have actually is covered that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions of the author? Well, you need more questions than this.
No, that's plenty, Mr. Chairman. It has been a long day. I do appreciate you having me here today, and appreciate you bringing this up.
We do have one more question.
Okay.
Representative Barr.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, is there a cap on the tag fee that you talked about, or is that the base, and then the community can decide?
The community can set it. It also has in here, it's up to the community as to what they want to charge, but also it also has in here a maximum. I didn't bring this up, but a maximum miles per hour. In other words, you can't have a vehicle that's souped up out there to run 55, 60 miles an hour, and I think that's an important part of this as well.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Other questions? I got a question. Just on the basis of this really prescribes 2 levels here. One's motorized carts, and the other is the personal transportation vehicle. So I want to make sure that we're still regarding the kids with the little carts that they put the red flag on that drive around on the public streets. That's illegal still.
That's correct.
And we're not really addressing that at all. These are and I think the cap on this is 25 miles an hour, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So it's going to affect just the communities that have those types of facilities available. I think you've got some other stuff in here that says it has to be a paved road and things like that. You just can't be running these off dirt roads in the forest someplace.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, seeing no other questions, I think it's a good piece of legislation. It's good for the state. Do I hear a motion? There's a move to pass. Is there a second? All right, move to pass the second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Like sign. Thank you, Mr. Roberts. You are on to rules. Another opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank y'all, members of the committee.
Okay. All right. let's see, I think we're going to take on, where's, there he is. Chairman Powell, I think you've got a bill that you want to bring before the committee, and that would be 753.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me put you on here.
I appreciate it. I'm sure that you noted how courteous I was not to get involved in that last bill.
It totally amazed me, Mr. Chairman.
But I will have to say that now this passed, you'll be revisiting that bill at some other form somewhere down the road because of law enforcement.
That's what keeps us all in positions that we're in.
I think that there's an amendment to this bill somewhere. Haven't been given one?
Well, let's find out a little bit more about this, and
I apologize.
let the chairman speak.
Well, simply 753. This is the annual DPS department bill. We call it, as we so affectionately know to call them, as a housekeeping bill. I know this is really kind of unusual because it's only 3.5 pages long this year, and these things usually we run them up 20, 30 pages with everything under the shining sun. But this is their bill this year. This basically puts them in compliance with the state and federal rules for safety maintenance under the federal codes for regulation. What you've had is that a couple of these issues, as they say, they've had to put the state in compliance with the federal rules because a lot of the district attorneys are now refusing not to prosecute cases unless the state has it. So it's a legal technicality that the prosecutors want that does this. And that's really all this does is puts us in compliance with the federal rules and regs. Now, I understand that there's a substitute, and I apologize.
Well, let me give you the opportunity for some recognition here. I think your microphone is on. Why don't you tell us who you are and who you represent?
My name is Todd Hayes. I'm with the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, and I am the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor for that agency. When we saw this bill, it is a very good piece of legislation, and we concur and support it. One thing we did want to point out to the committee and offer as a substitute, it is not really an amendment, it's an addition after the very end of the bill, and it is simply this. As the committee is aware, the Georgia Supreme Court has repeatedly held that when the General Assembly wants to enact regulations and cause those regulations to be enforced criminally, there's a very specific way that has to be done. And referencing back 2 years, we've done that recently with Department of Natural Resources regulations, and so we know what the language is. And we are just simply requesting that language be put into the back of the bill so that, just as the chairman said, we can enforce those legally when it gets to court. And I do have the amendment with me if you'd like me to hand that out.
Yeah, why don't you make that available to the committee? Why don't you just speak to the substance of it while we're waiting for it to be passed?
Certainly, yes, sir. It's very simple and very short. In order for regulations that are intended by the General Assembly to be enforced criminally, to have the force of criminal law, what you have to do is you have to effectively take a snapshot of the regulations you're talking about at a particular point in time. And so the language simply says that for purposes of establishing criminal violations of the regulations promulgated under 49 CFR as enumerated in this code section, the term present regulations means those regulations of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration in force and effect on July 1st of 2014, which would be the effective date of the bill as written. That way you're just taking a snapshot of the federal regulations that you're talking about, and everyone can refer to them, and that way they can be enforced.
Mr. Hayes, questions for Mr. Hayes? Mr. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have no problems with this. Anytime the Prosecuting Attorneys Council can agree with me on something makes me feel pretty important. I want to apologize to the chair and to the committee. I do have a substitute and some other additional language that has been requested by the Department of Public Safety and the Governor's Office due to the most recent situation with the winter storms, and I'll take full responsibility. Apparently it has not caught up to the committee yet, and it's over at Leg Council. whatever the will of the chair would be, we can either go get it or postpone action on this bill until we get that language.
Why don't we do this? I haven't seen it either. So what's the length and substance of the?
The substance of this would deal with the closures of roads due to inclement weather. The situation we experienced last week would deal with restrictions in how motor vehicle compliance, how they would enforce commercial traffic. Some of the language requires chains for commercial vehicles during the months of October through April. Allows for signage to be posted if there's a winter storm warning such as last week, and that commercial vehicles such as the large trucks would have to have the chains if the roads became iced over, and things such as this. A little bit of proactive stuff that the department wants to do. And I certainly, you have caught me off guard, and I take full blame. Unfortunately, Public Safety Committee has had me chewing on the barrel of a gun for the last several days.
Well, that's twice in one day. That's amazing. But
I'm humble.
This is the most number of apologies, Chairman Powell, that I've ever gotten from you in all my years of service.
Mr. Chairman, as I get older, I'm getting soft and gentle. I'm just an old wussy cat.
If it's okay with the author, I'd really like to table for and pick this up, and we'll move on it. I think there is some opposition to the substitute from what I've heard, so I'd like to have a full discussion of that when we get to it. Are there any questions on the Federal Motor Carrier Act change? This comes with federal dollars associated with it too, right? And this is the normal cleanup. With regard to the Prosecuting Attorney's Council, the author have an issue with any of the amendments that he wanted to make?
Have no problems with their language.
Okay. Is there anybody on the committee who wants to ask a question of Mr. Hayes with regard to this? Okay. All right, we're going to suspend on this bill for now, and we'll pick this back up again on Tuesday of next week.
Sounds good, and I thank you.
All right, thank you, Chairman Powell. We're going to move on to Mr. Harrell's bill. That is 762. And Mr. Harrell, why don't you tell us about sanitation workers and trash trucks and move over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As with
Chairman Roberts, this is also my first time before motor vehicles, so I'm pleased to be here. It's been an honor to sit next to you on the House floor for the last 3 years. And have you
That buys you absolutely nothing.
And never introduced the bill didn't meet your high standards.
Oh.
And so that's what we have today in House Bill 762.
Wow. It's all kinds of accolades today. It's amazing.
Motorists to use due caution when approaching or passing certain vehicles like emergency vehicles or highway maintenance vehicles, other towing vehicles when they're actively working in the roadway, and if possible to change lanes, reduce speed, and if it wasn't possible to change lanes because of the law or other conditions, then that motorist should be prepared to slow down or stop when there's active work going on the roadway. So what House Bill 762 does simply is it adds the active sanitation worker to those vehicles that are already in law, and that says when a sanitation worker is actively working in the roadway, lights operating on the truck, that the motorist approaching that vehicle should use due caution, and should that not occur and the motorist be cited, then they could be cited for a misdemeanor traffic violation with a maximum fine of up to $500. Again, that fine is identical to the fine in current code for the other types of vehicles. Before we left the floor this morning, Mr. Chairman mentioned, I might need to explain why this was necessary, and what many people may not realize, of course, a sanitation worker has no choice but to work in the roadway. In many cases, there's nowhere else for him to perform his duty. And as recent as 2012, sanitation workers by our Department of Labor is ranked the 4th most dangerous job in the United States. Over half of the workers that are injured in sanitation field are injured by traffic accidents, and it's not the driver in the big truck hitting somebody, but it's the actual workers that are out of the truck and doing their job that are sometimes injured, and unfortunately 14 out of 27 injuries in 2012 were fatalities across the state. So again, it simply adds those active workers that have no place to do their job other than in the roadway to the existing statute, which is commonly called the Spencer Pass Law.
Okay, questions of Representative Harrell? Do you think it ought to be? Oh, there is a question. All right, Mr. Parr.
Representative Harrell, I was just curious if you have any personal experience on the back of one of these vehicles.
I appreciate the question, Representative Barr. Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. As you know, I am a garbage man. So I do have some experience, although it's very limited. It's not my normal position with the company, but I certainly have empathy for those that are out there doing their job. And again, this would affect. I might add that this will affect public sector sanitation workers, those that work for cities and counties, as well as private sector sanitation workers.
And one follow-up: the numbers, the 14, those were Georgia numbers? Or
No, sir. Those were actually state nationwide numbers.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
sir, not Georgia.
That was surprising. Thank you.
So the question not only has to do with the fatalities, it also has to do with injuries. It also has to do with accidents that are insured and insurance premiums and all the rest of that goes with any kind of an incident such as this. Do you have any understanding of the number of instances that were in the state that have
well,
any bearing on it?
Not the exact number in Georgia. For example, there's the fatality rate is 27 per 100,000 for sanitation workers, and the only 3 occupations as recent as 2012 that had more deaths per 100,000 are fishermen was number 1, loggers was number 2, and pilots was number 3, and then sanitation workers. So, I mean, clearly, this is more dangerous than steel workers, than the people that work on our electrical high voltage. And a lot of that might be different levels of training and safety. More dangerous than your local firefighter or police officer, as measured by deaths per 1,000, actually. So it certainly is in Georgia. There, as recently as 2011, there was a sanitation worker that was struck and pinned him to the back of a vehicle, and he survived, but his leg was amputated. That was in 2011. In 2009, there was a 34-year-old sanitation worker here in Georgia that was again pinned to the back of his vehicle, and he lost his life in that particular accident.
Any other questions of the author of the bill? Do I hear a motion on the bill? The move to pass. There's a second. Okay. All in favor of the measure say aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Aye. All right, Mr. Howe, you can try and get that onto the rules calendar. I'm sure John will be glad to entertain you.
Thank you very much.
Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. We're going to pick up on Representative Powell's bill. That's an important bill, and we're going to need to deal with that next week. And I'll see you all then. We're adjourned.